Hello, and welcome to this Tungsten Cluster Masterclass training session where we are going to look at how to use and configure the API. My name is Chris Parker, VP of Customer Success here at Continuant. So in this short course, we're going to discuss what the API is, how to enable it and how to access it, some little working examples, and then talk about some of the possibilities of the things you can view with the various API calls. So what is the API? Well, it's a public RESTful API. We released version 2 in version 7 of the Tungsten Clustering and Tungsten Replicator products, and we released API V8, which was in the V8 version of our products. The V8 was some simpler endpoints, some refinements with a reduced number of those entry points. The key foundations that influenced the development of the API was obviously security first. In version 8, it's mandatory to provide an admin user and password at installation time, and no longer possible to create them without any credentials. In version 2, this was optional. The API runs on localhost only by default, so only calls on that localhost can access the endpoints. So you would need to change that if you wanted to open that out to the wider network. And SSL is also enabled by default. There is a per layer API, so each component has its own API, and the per host instances. So passwords are stored securely on each host. Of course, the installation tool, TPM, allows the deployment of identical user password pairs across nodes, as does the dashboard, but obviously it's a per instance installation. With the API provides read-only information through GET calls. Creation of resources is made through host calls, or in version 2, it was put calls. The updates in version 8 and version 2 with the put calls, and deletions through delete calls in version 8, and also again with put calls in version 2. So you can see there have been some slight changes between version 2 and version 8. The concepts, the development, the endpoints are all pretty much the same. There is extensive documentation online at docs.continuant.com. And within those docs as well, we also have links to the full developer docs, which outline all of the endpoints for the different versions with working examples. I don't cover them all in this training session as there are simply far too many. I do recommend that you go review that and find the information there. How do you enable the API credentials? Well, within your Tungsten INI, you need to specify REST API admin user and REST API admin password. As I said a moment ago, this is mandatory in version 8. If you don't have them in your configuration at installation time, the install will fail in version 8, whereas they are optional in version 7. Additional users can be created using the create admin user API call, either through curl or the TAPI command line tools. In version 7, you can use the create admin user to create that first user as well if you don't specify it during install time. The API itself is enabled by default, but if you want to disable it or explicitly enable it, you can use the REST APIs equals true or false option. Or if you want, you can specify the component-REST API equals true or false for each of the individual components. So replicator and then the manager and the connector if you are using clustering. Obviously, the manager and connector options are not applicable if you are only using the standalone Tungsten replicator. The listening address by default is on localhost 127.0.0.1. So to change that, you would specify REST API address equals whatever IP range you want, or again, the individual component versions of those properties. So if you set the REST-API-address, that will set that value for all of the components, or you can say individually for each component if you wish. To enforce authentication, this is enabled by default, but should you wish to disable it or explicitly disable, then you have the REST API authentication property, or once again, the individual component versions of that property. If you want to enable SSL, so this would be the HTTP/HTTPS calls, again, enabled by default, but to explicitly enable/disable, then you can specify the API-SSL property or the individual component versions of that property. The API ports, the defaults shown here. So the replicator on 8097, manager on 8090, and the connector is on 8096. Obviously, if you are using the standalone replicator, the manager and the connector properties are not applicable. You don't need to specify these values unless you want to change the port to something different, naturally ensuring your own network security rules are configured accordingly. So how do you access the API? Curl is the simplest method. Just use the curl command on your CLI. We have a tool called TAPI or TAPI. This is a wrapper for the curl commands. It's simple to use. It has shortcuts and options to make those calls. This is a fully functional tool for API v2, so that would be in all of the version 7s of our Tungsten products. For version 8, not all of the functions will work yet. There is still some work to be done there, but you can try it specifying the --API ver8 on the various calls. Some calls will work, some calls won't work, so it is a bit of an experimental feature for version 8. And then there's also Postman, which is a third party and probably one of the most popular GUI tools for accessing and controlling APIs. So some examples, typical curl example here. This is doing a ping. This is a v2 endpoint. You see in the URL there, v2. If you are running version 8 of the software, then you can change that v2 to v8. And this is an example of the payload that you would get as a result of that request. Here we see an example using the v8 endpoint for Replicator services. So this would be the equivalent of if you executed trepctl services on the command line. This is the API call equivalent, giving you the payload of the services information. There's also the status information as well, which is the much longer trepctl status output, for example. And here we have an example of a put command in v8. This one is taking the replicator online. So there are all the various options of puts and for online, offline for the status changes for the replicator. TAPI or TAPI equivalent for the replicator services. You see it's much easier. You don't need to necessarily remember what that full URL is. You can just do TAPI -r and then replicator/services. And here I've issued the --API ver8 so that it uses the version 8 endpoint to give me that services output. The connector API can be used for viewing the connector status, looking at and changing the operational states of the connector, offline, online, etc. You can change the configuration, so you can change the proxy methods and the proxy modes, various timeout settings. A lot of the properties that you can change in the INI, you can change here by using the API. You can also manage the in-memory user map entries, bearing in mind though that if you change it in the API, it is only changed in memory. So if the connector were to restart, any of these properties would be lost. So you would need to make the changes to the files if you want them to be kept throughout the running state of the connector. In the manager, you can view things like the manager status, topology information of your cluster. You can create modified data sources, create full cluster configurations, change those data source states so you can take nodes into a shunned state, recover nodes, issue the recover commands. You can also initiate switches and failovers. For the replicator, you can view status of replicator services. As you saw in my examples there, we used the TAPI command for replicator services as well as the get call with the URL. You can take replicators offline, online, reset services. Also with the Replicator API, you can initiate backups and restores. You can change replicator roles. And finally, you can view THL info, view the THL index information. And you can even enable and disable the THL compression and encryption using the API calls. There are many other possibilities. A lot of these, as I say, are listed in the documentation. With all of these possibilities, you can then start to create your own calls to the various endpoints to feed into your own monitoring solutions. The Tungsten dashboard that we have, the product we have, uses the API to provide the dashboard endpoints. And a lot of the command line tools that you may be familiar with also takes use of the API calls. So it's really, really powerful, very useful. It was new in version 7. Continually being improved in version 8, and it will continually be improved as we go throughout the lifetime of our products. So in summary, what have we learned? Well, we looked at what the API is, how do we enable it, and how do we access it. We looked at a few examples and then discussed the various actions that can be taken using the API, all the options to view services and status summaries and things like that. So I hope you found this useful. It is just a bit of an introduction and a taster of the API. It is quite a big topic, so I do recommend you review that documentation that I mentioned at the start of the session, and you'll find a lot more possibilities, and it will make your experience of accessing the cluster and replicators and managing the product much more fluid and simple. So thank you for listening and take care. Goodbye.